But I would suggest to people not to dismiss conspiracy theorists or conspiracy theory as something that is um, completely refutable sort of nonsense, because clearly there is conspiring going on.
Dr. Niall McCrae was a senior lecturer in mental health at King's College London. He writes regularly for the Salisbury Review and the Conservative Woman on themes of democracy and freedom of speech. He's written several books, including The Moon and Madness, Echoes from the Corridors, Moralitis, a Cultural Virus, and his latest book, Green in Tooth and Claw, the Misanthropic Mission of Climate Alarm. So, Niall McCrae, thank you much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on, Philip.
Niall, tell me about the book and why you wrote it and what it's about.
That was largely kind of spurred by my experience at King's of being bombarded with all this radical ideology, relating to the identity politics of feminism. And
does King's College at London University go big on this? Because I must say I've been fairly well treated at Bournemouth University, where I am, and there's not a huge emphasis on it there. But King's, what's it like?
Yes, well, ironically, it's the more prestigious a university, the more they push this sort of thing. So in no disrespect, Philip, but in a relative backwater like Bournemouth, you can be protected from this nonsense to some extent, but they really, really do push it at the sort of leading Russell Group universities. But so that was my experience, and seeing how this beast was getting ever more powerful year after year. So when I started my lecturing role there in 2010, you could kind of ignore the stuff that came through on the intranet. It'd be a mild irritant, but it didn't really have too much impact. But over the years, it became more and more of an imposition, and they were doing things like unconscious bias training. That was mandatory training, and critical race theory and feminism and the LGBT agenda was becoming, it was dominating the atmosphere in the university. And so I wrote this book with Robert Oles, explaining how woke ideology emerged, where it came from. And it's all can be traced back to cultural Marxism of the 1920s, the Frankfurt School. I saw that woke was only one side of the coin. There are two sides of a coin that are being used to radically engineer society. And one of them is woke and the other is green in inverted commas, because I think the whole thing is a scam, and it's being, it's net zero and global boiling and all this stuff. So you'll hear the likes of Toby Young with his Daily Skeptic website repeatedly criticize what they call cancel culture. And that is something that's very real, obviously. There are, academics being forced out of their jobs for wrongthink. But I think that term misses the trick, because cancel culture, cancelling is something that only happens to that tiny minority of people who, put their heads above the parapet. And most ordinary people have got no idea that this cancelling is going on. Obviously, the Daily Skeptic website and the Free Speech Union will make lots of noise about cancellations, but most people are blissfully ignorant that this is going on. What I think is far more pervasive is something that I call conformity culture. And that explains what you've just said, that people who believe in woke ideology also believe in the green ideology, because this is a strategy kind of taken from Marxism and communism, about indoctrinating youth, molding society. The communists talked about molding a new man, and you've got to start them young. Lenin followed the Jesuits in this by saying, give me the child that's 7 or 8 years old, and I will make that child a communist. But why are all the countries of the world, particularly developed nations, the West, if you like, why do they all seem to be following exactly the same, singing from the same hymn sheet, and often doing things that their populace doesn't really want, like, for example, mass immigration? Why do they keep doing things that people haven't voted for and are actually diametrically opposed to in many cases?
It's a good question. Why?
Yeah. So who's running the show? And that's a question which I can't answer exactly, because as I've said in the book Green in Tooth and Claw, any public figure, like take, for example, Klaus Schwab, of the recently retired leader of the World Economic Forum. He looks like a sort of James Bond villain. Yeah. And then you've got characters like Bill Gates and George Soros and Tony Blair, Anthony Fauci, all these characters that are often seen as being the ones that are doing all kinds of manipulations to make us behave in certain ways that suit them for some agenda. But I believe that if you and I know their names and know their faces, these people are not really at the top. I think the top of the pyramid will be people who shadowy people who we don't know, and we won't know because they won't tell us. And that sounds, like really sort of the conjecture of wild conspiracy theory, perhaps. But
I was just about to say the same thing. I mean, if you're saying there's some shadowy group of people pulling the strings on all governments, it does sound incredibly conspiracy theory-like, and many people would just dismiss it for that reason.
Yes. Well, I would say, Philip, that the time has long gone where you can dismiss conspiracy theory absolutely. I think that, I remember probably about 10 years ago now, I was in a railway station and I just picked up from a W.H. Smith's a book about conspiracy theories, and it had all the stuff in there, like the moon landings and Princess Diana, JFK assassination. And at the time, I just tended to think there were people who, perhaps they had nothing better to do than to dream up sort of explanations for why Princess Diana was killed, and the Titanic never really sank, and things like that. And it always seemed to me to be a bit sort of slightly mad. Nowadays, I think that it's quite clear there is conspiring going on. And that's not to say that I believe the Titanic didn't sink, but I believe that the conspiring is quite blatant now. I mean, we have all of our governments in the West, Starmer being a good example, who I think really could genuinely be described as puppet governments. But puppets for whom? And that is the question which I can't satisfactorily answer. But I would suggest to people not to dismiss conspiracy theorists or conspiracy theory as something that is completely refutable sort of nonsense, because clearly there is conspiring going on. And the difficulty for us as ordinary people is trying to work out who, why, and how these things are being done. In Green and Tooth and Claw, I've basically explained this as the The plan is to create a two-tier society.
To the famous quote by Schwab and others that you will not own anything, but you'll be happy.
Yeah, yes, that's right, and you can see this. There are clear trends towards that sort of mantra of the World Economic Forum. The ownership is declining everywhere, and now. Just as a sort of trivial example of that, when I was younger, I had all my friends would have lots of music in the form of either vinyl or later CDs.
Yeah.
And then people collected a large sort of video, of their DVDs and that sort of thing. Now, young people don't tend to have anything physical that's audio visual. It's all streamed. They don't own anything. They will own nothing and be happy, as you said, Philip. But more importantly is things like ownership of homes is steadily declining now. And if you look at these apartment blocks that are going up in cities across the country, even that small towns have got large apartment blocks being built next to the railway station, that sort of thing. Some of these flats will be bought outright, but often they're classed as large sections of them are classed as social housing. And then you've got like 25% ownership plans, which isn't really ownership at all. And that's the way things are going with young people growing up today, children growing up, the prospects for them being homeowners is reducing all the time. People won't own cars in the future. I think that's quite clear. So that is a good example, Philip, you gave of one of the part of the agenda of the globalists, which is that the ordinary people will own nothing.
I've always responded to that in the sense, well, it's all very well to say people won't own anything, but they'll be happy. But then somebody owns it. Who are the people who? There is obviously going to be a class of people who do own the things, and they'll presumably be even happier.
Well, that's exactly right. And who will own it will be a very small elite number of people. In Green and Tooth and Claw, my book, I chart the beginnings of the technocracy movement. And I'm sure many of your viewers will have read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. That is a book that describes technocracy. And Aldous Huxley himself was very much a technocrat. He was also a Fabian. Technocracy was being promoted quite heavily in the 1930s, long before there were any computers, but they could see the way things were going. There was a lot of technological advances during the First World War. And clearly, the things were going in the direction of the potential for controlling everything. And technocracy can be summarized in one short phrase is total technological control of population and resources.
We have what people have called really a uni party, a party where it doesn't really matter who you vote for. You are getting the same thing all the time. In fact, someone once described democracy to me as being, you get one vote every 5 years between two or three things which are identically the same, which unfortunately has a ring of truth about it. But what do you make of the resurgence quite recently of the Reform Party and Nigel Farage's success only this last week in the elections? Is that heralding something different, or is it more of the same?
But you say it in one word, Philip, uni party. That's where it is. And I think that it's at least positive that people are waking up to that there's no real difference between Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrats, certainly not when they're in power. They all do the same thing. They all follow the same agenda. So if Reform Party can help to, smash that two-party system that we've had for, well, we've always had a two-party system. I mean, the only difference is that the Labour Party replaced the Liberals in the early 20th century. But if they can smash that two-party system, then I think that's potentially a good thing. But I would counsel people against believing that Nigel Farage or the Reform Party are going to be our saviours. The Labour Party, which has always been controlled by the Fabians, and the Fabians are no friend of the ordinary working class people. The Fabians have used the Labour Party ever since it started, it was founded. And many of the cabinet today, Starmer's cabinet, are Fabians. And people need to know what the Fabians are about. The Fabians logo is the wolf in sheep's clothing. And the Fabians have utter contempt for the patriotic, traditionalist, white working class. And they will do anything and everything to show that contempt. And it's only been in the last 20 years or so, I think, that you've seen the voting patterns in white working class areas shift. They talked about the red wall, didn't they?
Yeah.
And how that was knocked down by a blue wave. But of course, people saw that the Conservatives weren't their friends either. They're now turning to the Reform Party. But people are realizing, and have realized for quite some time now, that the Labour Party is not a friend of the white working class. In the elections last Thursday, Durham Council, one of the most Labour of all Labour areas, the Labour councillors were almost entirely kicked out. I think they only won 4 out of the 70 seats or something like that.
Yeah.
They all most went to Reform. So I think, to answer your question, and again in a sort of roundabout way, I don't think the Labour Party is just pandering to the minority ethnic communities. I think it is pursuing an agenda against the white working class.
Well, that's quite a radical statement, because I mean, I recall what George Orwell wrote about the Labour Party. He said he used to meet with some of these people, these socialists, and they were in their nice sweaters and they drank tea. And he said what really struck him forcefully was that these people were no friends of the working class. In fact, he said they despised the working class.
Yeah.
And he couldn't understand how it was that these people were in the Labour Party and they despised the working class that they're meant to stand for. And then suddenly he said, it struck me. He said, it's not that they like or love the working class, it's just that they hate the Tories. And that was the whole motivation behind it. But anyway.
Yeah. So the Tories, by their very name, Conservative, they are a bulwark against progressivism. Now, when people describe themselves as progressive, it's not a term I hear so much these days, but I used to hear it in the university, and I did sometimes ask people, okay, so you're progressive. Where are you progressing to? And they could never tell me, because of course they don't realize that they're useful idiots for the people who are really running the world, and for whom the progress is all for the elite. And a phrase I've used in my book on the climate scam is it's not that they want to save the planet, the elite. They want to save the planet for themselves.
Well, interesting. I mean, the term useful idiots, I think, was a Stalinist term where he had a lot of people who would um, put into practice his ideas on the ground. And I think it's a very suitable term because the term idiot indicates the idea that you don't really know what you're doing. And it's quite striking that when you find that you ask people about climate or carbon zero or other political issues, what the reasons are behind it, they can't articulate a reason.
Yeah.
It's kind of like they're swept up in a wave of popularity or ideas or ideology without really understanding the principles behind it and couldn't articulate them or explain them if they were asked to do so. And that, I think, is the test for whether you're one of these useful idiots or whether you're someone who thinks for themselves.
Absolutely, and you see that both with green and with woke. Very few younger people who are indoctrinated into this climate crisis can really understand or explain, about carbon dioxide or global temperature patterns. They don't really have any idea about it because it's conformity culture. And on the woke side, when you think back to 2020 and that hysteria, Black Lives Matter. If you got the chance to ever ask somebody, why do you think a common felon in Minneapolis was worth these huge global protests? And during the lockdown period as well for COVID-19, what was it about this man, George Floyd, that made it so essential for these demonstrations to be held all around the world and for everyone to be implored to read anti-racist books and so on? And of course, they can never explain that. So I think, Philip, there's two audiences for everything that happens on our mainstream media and on our news programming. There's what you might call the normies, the people that won't really question anything. They'll just accept things. They just believe, well, things happen, they're on the news, and take it largely as fact. They know that there'll be different interpretations and people using it in certain ways, but they'll accept that things happened as they're reported. And then there's the critical thinkers who they know, the people in power, that there are critical thinkers who can see that Katy Perry rocket into space was a scam. But they're trolling us. They're showing, look, this is how much we're in control. They are rubbing our noses in it.
I've often thought too that the main distinction between people in society are not political distinctions, but rather the distinction between whether you think for yourself or whether you allow others just to tell you what to think and you go along with the crowd. And I've often thought that that's the main distinction, and that unfortunately the people who are thinking for themselves form only about 5 or 10%, if that, of the total population, which is a huge indictment of society. I came to that view after the COVID stuff, but because everyone seemed to be on board with something which I thought was rather odd. But there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. And the psychological experiments of the 1950s showed that only a very small minority of the population can actually think for themselves and act for themselves.
Yeah.
And so I do believe that if you're going to build a resistance to the way things are being taken on this sort of globalist agenda, then you can't rely too much on trying to wake up the majority of society. They will not wake up sufficiently or on time to mount any sort of resistance. So I think it's got to be about the minority who are awake, if you like, and building a sort of active resistance, and not depending on people who tend to believe what they're told in the news. And I find with COVID, for example, as you just mentioned, Philip, I find that there are many people now. I mean, I give out a newspaper called The Light, which is very came out during the COVID-19 debacle, and it was taking a very critical view of everything that was being done by the government for that. But now it's a more general sort of critical newspaper, and has got lots of stuff in it that people will think, oh, it's mad conspiracy theory, perhaps. But it is having an impact, and you can see people starting to realize now that maybe things weren't done properly during COVID and weren't necessarily done for our benefit, and maybe some other agenda was at work. So you do see that, but most people only find things out just gradually and won't really necessarily do anything about it. And I had this thought during COVID-19, when Boris Johnson was doing his daily press conferences, and the vaccine was on its way. And I had this thought that, if Boris Johnson was to stand up and say, I'm very sorry to the British people, but I have to tell you that this whole thing has been a scam. I'm very sorry, but it's something that we had to do. But no, you can go back to your normal lives now. The whole thing was a scam, and obviously that wouldn't have happened. But just if he had have done that, people would still have been queuing up for the vaccine.
Mm. Yes.
You see, this is how much people are in the grip of a narrative created, maintained, and continually fed by the powers that be. People want to be ordered around. People want to be told what to do. Quite clearly, Philip, COVID-19 brought a massive redistribution of wealth from the ordinary people to the rich. I mean, that's quite clear. That's not wild conspiracy theory. The data are there, and the lockdown were devastated countries, both socially and economically, but it didn't devastate the people who are the super rich, did it? They were making money from it, and of course, the vaccine, as you state, was a lucrative money spinner. But I don't believe that money is the ultimate motive for the people who are running the world. I mean, obviously, they are grasping more and more of the resources, financial and otherwise.
You think it's about power?
Yeah, it's. I would say it's power. Power. Money is just a vehicle, I think, a sort of currency of power. But what my book explains, because I'm sure some of your viewers may be thinking this is a bit far-fetched, but what my book explains is how and why they're creating a two-tier society. As technology becomes more advanced and AI takes over, there won't be jobs for the multitude, and the devil makes work for idle hands. So people will, millions, billions of people in this world will be reduced to the status of what Yuval Noah Harari, the scientific advisor to the World Economic Forum, called useless eaters. And those useless eaters will not be allowed to exist unless they can be adequately controlled, harnessed, and if they serve some use for the technocratic elite. So we are looking at dark times ahead. But the crucial thing is that we build a effective resistance, because our government, whether it's Starmer's government or Rishi Sunak's before, they're not working for us.
One of the things that you'll need in order to do something like that would be the ability to freely speak and communicate. What's the status of free speech today in our society?
Yes, the worst criminals of all for the increasingly authoritarian kind of powers that be are thought criminals. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote about this in Gulag Archipelago, where he found as himself, he was an inmate in one of the gulags in the Soviet Union. And he found that people that were sent there for 10 years, 20 years, most of whom perished, of course, in the Siberian cold, if they'd been sent to prison sent to the gulag system for, just saying something against communism, just a throwaway comment could get you sent away.
Like a tweet.
In those gulags, there was a pecking order, and the violent recidivist criminals, the rapists and murderers, they lorded over the thought criminals, because the thought criminals were the lowest of the low. And you can see that nowadays with Starmer. So after the Southport killings in summer 2024, there were hundreds of arrests. I think about 1,000 people sent to prison. And many of the people sent to prison weren't even at any of the protests, never mind committed any violent act. They were imprisoned just for saying something on Facebook or Twitter. So you can see that Starmer is pursuing the same agenda of the communist system that ran in the Soviet Union, of targeting free thinkers, people who speak out, because for authoritarians, words are much more dangerous than weapons.
What's your view of non-crime hate incidents?
Well, that's just a very clear illustration of what I've just been talking about. It's that they are criminalizing freedom of speech, but more importantly, Philip, they're criminalizing the truth. You see, that and George Orwell's 1984, they got people to deny what they could see with their own eyes and what they could hear with their own ears, so that they believed, and genuinely believed. Such is the power of the system. They genuinely believed that 2 + 2 = 5. And it is dangerous in such a system, to have someone who says, hold on, 2 + 2 = 4. Look, I can show you. Dangerous.
Where do you see Donald Trump in all of this? Is he a hero or a villain?
I must say, I've always had a soft spot for Donald Trump. I find him he's an incredible character, isn't he? And there's never a dull moment with him around. and I was very much a supporter of him in 2016 in his first presidency. I believed that the 2020 election was clearly rigged against him. But Trump was never really one of us, was he? I mean, his background is in the sort of Manhattan property speculation, and he was a Democrat in the past. I would say about Donald Trump today that there are some things that he's doing that are very good. I mean, even this tariffs thing, which is being reported in our mainstream media as if it's some chaotic, destructive thing. I can see why it's being done. But if you put together Donald Trump and Mark Carney, the new leader in Canada, and Keir Starmer, right, and maybe Giorgia Meloni of Italy, right, and they're all presented as being very different, different political sort of backgrounds and perspectives. But I would say that Donald Trump has got more in common with Keir Starmer than he has with people living in the flyover states of the USA. Similarly, I'd say Keir Starmer has got more in common with Donald Trump than he has with the ordinary voters of Hartlepool and Runcorn.
Yeah, possibly so. But Donald Trump is seen as a bit of a savior insofar as he's trying to wind back much of this woke things, or many of his executive orders have been against DEI and those kind of things. So I would have thought he was quite different from Starmer, who seems to be tied into the woke idea and to the DEI approach.
Yeah. Well, what you've got to remember about woke ideology is that, I mean, patently, it's nonsense. These principles that they come out with are not really principles at all. They're just, double standards are everywhere in the woke ideology. Woke is just a vehicle. It's woke is using cultural Marxism for divide and rule purposes. There is no real allegiance of the powers that be to gay people, Muslims, feminists, or any other group that is, apparently favoured in the complex of identity politics. So if Trump overturns some sort of woke ideology which has been running, uncontested in the West, like, for example, we've had that Supreme Court ruling in the UK against the trans ideology. Overturning something like this seems dramatic at the time. It seems like, oh, look, this is, the whole house of cards is going to come falling down. But woke ideology is used to divide and rule. And anti-woke ideology is the same. It's used to divide and rule.
We're a very divided society, and that's a bad point to end on. We've come to the end roughly of our time, Neil. And I've only got through 4 out of my 20-odd questions. And I don't have time to fit the other ones in. But I was hoping to reveal something of the nature of Niall McCrae, and I've got, maybe it's my last. I've got a set of choices for you to make, if you don't mind. If I give you alternatives, you choose in a quick fire session which one you're most attracted to or which one is the best. So on a range of different topics, and these are cultural and taste topics. So what do you prefer most? Gordon Ramsay's restaurants or Wetherspoons?
Wetherspoons.
Electric cars or diesel cars?
Diesel.
The Beatles or Bach? Oh, that's got you thinking.
Yeah. Do I have to choose one or the other?
Quick.
Bark.
Bark. Good. Okay. John Constable or Hockney?
Constable.
Smashed avocado or bacon and eggs?
Bacon, but without the eggs.
Beach or museum?
Museum.
And football or cricket? And I've got one more after that.
Mm. I'm afraid I'll have to go with football. Only just.
Football. And soap or opera?
Opera.
Opera. Gosh. So quite a highbrow person, Niall McCrae. I cheated because I've got one last question, if you don't mind. And that is, if I asked you to look ahead to the next 20, 30, maybe 50 years, where do you see our society being? Is it in a better place than it is now, or is it in a worse place?
That's an incredibly tough question to end on, and but it's an important question. Clearly, I'm going to really hedge on that. I mean, I think it really does depend. Clearly, if the powers that be get their way, it will be a very much worse society than it is now. It will be a dystopian new world order, and the only people who will be happy will be the elite. But I do have a lot of faith in the human spirit, Philip, and I think that much of what they're trying to do to us is dehumanizing, and I think that human beings, once they realize that they're being dehumanized, will rise against what's being done, and we will have very interesting times. I suppose all I can say really is that things are going to get worse before they get better. But in the long run, I think that humanity will win out.
Niall McCrae, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating conversation today. Thank you.